On the morning of November 29th, 1970, a man was hiking with his two young daughters through Isdalen, a remote valley on the outskirts of Bergen. The name Isdalen translates to Ice Valley. Locals had another name for it too, one that had nothing to do with the cold. They called it Death Valley because for generations the terrain there had swallowed people, hikers who lost their footing, a handful of suicides going back decades. It was the kind of place with a reputation long before this particular morning gave it a new one. The father and his daughters were making their way along the base of a rock face when they came across something in a small hollow among the scree. At first, it might have looked like debris. Then the shape resolved into something unmistakably human. A woman's body burned almost past recognition, lying on her back among blackened stones. Her right arm rested across her chest. Her left arm was stretched out in front of her, bent at the elbow, as if she'd been reaching for something or warning something away. The father got his daughters away from the scene and went straight to the police. When investigators arrived, they found more than a body. They found a scene that looked staged. Bottles were scattered nearby, their labels scraped off. A burned fur hat sat close to her, a style that would have looked completely out of place in Norway, more commonly worn thousands of miles away in Central Asia. There were the remnants of nylon stockings, the ruins of rubber boots, an umbrella, jewelry, a wristwatch, and a half-melted plastic container that might once have held water. One of the forensic investigators who worked the scene would later describe it simply. It looked like there had been some kind of ceremony, and there was the fire itself, or rather the strange absence of one. The body was severely burned, especially the face and much of the hair, but there was no evidence of a large fire ever having burned in that spot. Whatever had caused those burns hadn't consumed the landscape around her. It had been contained somehow to her alone. An autopsy later concluded that she died from a combination of sleeping pills and carbon monoxide poisoning that may have come from a small fire, possibly a campfire, positioned close enough to affect her without spreading. She was estimated to be somewhere between 25 and 40 years old, about 5'4", brown eyes, long dark hair, and a mouth full of extensive dental work, 14 fillings, several gold crowns, the kind of dentistry rarely seen in someone that young and rarely seen at all in Norway. It was work more consistent with dental practices from Central or Southern Europe, or further afield entirely. She had no identification on her, nothing that said who she was, where she'd come from, or why she was lying dead in a valley outside a city she apparently had no connection to. That should have been the beginning of a straightforward identification process. Instead, it was the beginning of one of the strangest unsolved cases in modern European history. Bergen police did what any department would do. They created a sketch of the woman's face and circulated it, first locally, then to hotels across the country. The response was almost immediate and almost impossible to process. Hotel after hotel came forward. They recognized her. She had stayed with them, but each hotel had her registered under a different name. Over the months before her death, she had checked into hotels and boarding houses across Norway, Oslo, Trondheim, Stavanger, Bergen, under at least 8 or 9 separate aliases: Genevieve Lancier, Claudia Tielt, Claudia Nielsen, Alexia Zarna Merches, Vera Jarl, Fenella Lork, names that shifted from city to city, hotel to hotel, each one presumably backed by a passport that would have had to be shown at check-in. Not one of those passports was ever recovered. Near her body, investigators found only the remains of what might have been a plastic passport cover, melted, destroyed, telling them nothing. The one detail that never changed across any of her aliases was her claimed nationality. She always said she was Belgian, and yet every single hotel registration card she filled out, she wrote in German. Staff who remembered her described a woman who was fashionable, quiet, and deliberate. She spoke poor English. Her German and what sounded like Flemish came out with an accent nobody could quite place. She requested room changes, she paid in cash, and in a detail that unsettled investigators more than almost anything else, staff recalled that after eating, she would wipe down surfaces and remove her own fingerprints from the glasses and utensils she'd used. That is not the behavior of a woman traveling for leisure. That is tradecraft. She'd been seen, on more than one occasion, dining with men, including, according to one witness, officers from a foreign navy. Bergen, where she died, was home to Norway's largest naval base, and in 1970, that base was involved in testing something called the Penguin missile system, a piece of NATO military technology developed during the height of the Cold War. This was not an era where a woman with false identities, erased fingerprints, and unexplained travel routes through a NATO naval city could be dismissed as simply eccentric. This was 1970. The Cold War wasn't a backdrop. It was the entire architecture the rest of Europe was operating inside of. Investigators eventually located her luggage at the Bergen railway station. Inside were more wigs, more clothing, and every label on every item removed, not ripped away, cut out carefully as if by someone trained to think about what a piece of fabric might reveal. They also found something else, a notebook filled with a private code. It took time, but police eventually cracked it. The code corresponded to dates and locations, a private itinerary of a woman's movements across an entire continent, written so that no one else could read it even if they found it. The notes told investigators where she had been. They told them nothing about why. If this were only a story about false names and disappearing fingerprints, it would already be strange enough. But there are witness accounts from her final days that push the story somewhere darker. One local man, years later, came forward with a memory from 5 days before the body was discovered. He'd been hiking in the hills above Bergen when he passed a woman walking ahead of him, dressed lightly, more suited to a city street than a hillside hike. Behind her, he recalled 2 men in heavy coats, men who struck him as foreign, unlike anyone from the area. The woman, he said, looked resigned. At one point, she seemed about to speak to him, and then didn't. He mentioned it to an acquaintance in the police at the time. He was told, in essence, to forget about it. It was never officially recorded. That single account, a woman being followed on a remote hillside, days before her death, by 2 unidentified men, is the kind of detail that could mean everything or nothing. It could be an unrelated hiking party. It could be the last confirmed sighting of the Isdal Woman being escorted toward whatever happened to her in that valley. Investigators also noted something odd on the day the body itself was found. Witnesses at the scene described an unfamiliar figure watching from a distance as police worked the site. That account, too, was never confirmed publicly, and whoever that figure was has never been identified. None of this proves murder, but all of it makes suicide a much harder theory to sit comfortably with. Despite the mountain of strange details, Norwegian authorities closed the case within a matter of weeks, officially ruling it most likely a suicide. The Isdal Woman was buried in a zinc coffin, a method meant to preserve remains in case a family ever came forward. She was given a Catholic funeral. The people who attended were almost entirely police officers standing in for a family that didn't exist, at least not one anyone could find. But even at the time, that ruling didn't sit right with everyone who worked the case. Some officers on the ground never accepted the suicide explanation, and said so for years afterward. And there is a theory, one that has only grown stronger with time, that the case wasn't closed quickly because it was simple. It was closed quickly because it wasn't. Norway's own domestic intelligence service reportedly opened a file on the Isdal Woman around the same time police were closing theirs. If she was connected to something larger, foreign intelligence operations, weapons testing, a Cold War chess match being played out on Norwegian soil, a fast, unremarkable public verdict of suicide would have been the cleanest way to make the story disappear from public attention, whatever the real answer was. For nearly 50 years, that's more or less where the case sat. A woman with no name, a death with no verdict anyone fully trusted, a file quietly gathering dust. In 2016, Norwegian broadcaster NRK, working alongside Bergen Police and Norway's National Crime Unit, reopened the case using tools that hadn't existed in 1970. DNA analysis, isotope testing on her teeth and bones, forensic facial reconstruction. The results only deepened the mystery. Isotope analysis of her tooth enamel suggested she likely spent her early childhood somewhere along the border regions of France and Germany, possibly moving through Germany, France, Luxembourg, and Belgium by her early teenage years, an upbringing that would explain the tangle of accents witnesses struggled to place. Even more striking, The scientific analysis suggested she was significantly older than anyone had assumed in 1970. Investigators at the time had estimated her age at somewhere between 25 and 30. The new analysis put her true age closer to 45. That gap matters. A woman who spent decades building fluency across multiple false identities, quietly shaving 10 to 20 years off her real age on every hotel form she ever filled out, is not someone improvising. That is a life built around disguise as a long-term practice, not a one-time act of desperation. Despite all of this new science, despite an Interpol notice reissued in 2017 and international media attention that followed, her DNA has never matched anyone in any database, anywhere. No family has ever come forward. No government has ever acknowledged she was one of theirs. Woman? Over 5 decades, a handful of theories have taken shape, and none of them close the case completely. The espionage theory is the oldest and most persistent. Everything about her behavior, the aliases, the erased fingerprints, the coded notebook, her presence near a NATO naval base during active missile testing, sightings of her with military personnel, reads like tradecraft. Under this theory, she was a spy, possibly for the Soviet bloc, possibly for a Western agency, caught in the middle of an operation that went wrong. Her death in this version wasn't a suicide at all. It was an execution, staged to look like something else, in a valley remote enough that no one would find her for days. The escort theory points to a different reading of the same facts. Her methodical, always returning travel routes, her wish for total anonymity, the way she marked hotel room doors in ways only she would recognize. Under this theory, she wasn't a spy. She was a high-end sex worker whose clients were the well-dressed men witnesses remembered seeing her with, men who, whatever their reasons, never once came forward after her death. This theory doesn't require Cold War intrigue to explain the secrecy. It only requires a woman whose livelihood depended on never being traceable, and a fatal encounter with someone she trusted or misjudged. The Swiss banker theory is the newest and in some ways the strangest. In recent years, journalists uncovered evidence connecting some of the Isdal Woman's final movements, trips through Paris and Switzerland in the months before her death, to a real historical figure. François Genoux, a Swiss financier known for funding extremist causes and for his documented sympathies toward Nazi ideology. Genoux maintained regular contact with associates across Belgium in 1970, the same year and region tied to some of the Isdal Woman's aliases. One line of speculation ties her travels to Norway's heavy water production, a substance critical to nuclear technology, and something Norway supplied internationally even in 1970. Under this theory, she wasn't a low-level operative at all, but a courier or intermediary in something with far higher stakes than anyone in 1970 was allowed to say publicly. And then there's the simplest, saddest theory of all, that there was no grand conspiracy, that a woman suffering from serious psychological distress constructed an elaborate world of false identities as a private escape from a life she couldn't bear to live under her real name, and that her death, however staged and strange it looked, was exactly what the original 1970 investigation concluded. A suicide carried out with the same secrecy she'd applied to everything else in her final months. Every one of these theories explains some of the evidence. None of them explain all of it. The spy theory doesn't fully explain why, if she were valuable enough to kill over, no intelligence agency on either side of the Cold War has ever quietly confirmed anything about her, even decades after it stopped mattering. The escort theory doesn't explain the coded notebook, or the missile testing, or the sightings near a military base. The banker theory rests on connections that are suggestive, not proven, and the suicide theory has never sat well with several of the investigators who were actually there, standing in that valley in November of 1970, looking at a scene one of them described as looking like some kind of ceremony. Here is what remains true more than 50 years later. A woman crossed an entire continent under at least 9 different names, none of which anyone has ever proven was real. She spent months, possibly years, systematically erasing every trace that could connect her to a past life, cutting labels out of clothing, wiping fingerprints from glassware, encoding her own itinerary so that even her private notes couldn't betray her if they were found. And then she ended up alone in a remote valley outside a Norwegian naval city, burned in a way that left no fire behind her, arranged in a position one investigator could only describe as ceremonial. No family has ever claimed her. No government has ever acknowledged her. No DNA database has ever returned her name. She is buried in Bergen under a placeholder, in a case that Norwegian police have never officially closed, waiting on the smallest possibility that someone, somewhere, still remembers a woman who disappeared under a name that wasn't hers and never came home. Whoever she really was, she built her entire final year around one singular goal: to make sure that if something happened to her, no one would ever be able to trace it back to who she'd actually been. She succeeded, completely and forever. If you had to disappear that thoroughly, erase every label, every fingerprint, every real name, what do you think you'd be running from?